Welcome to the Political Potatoes podcast series, Idaho Inside Out, uncovering the plot to take over the Gem State. In this series, we will explore the various tactics used by those trying to wrestle control of Idaho politics and the Idaho Republican Party inside one of the reddest states in the nation. While some of the policies and shenanigans might feel like inside baseball, the ideas behind them are not new. In fact, many mirror those of grifters and con artists who perfected the art of confidence schemes to help achieve a specific goal. In Idaho, the target more often is influence and power, and each episode will uncover how the great Idaho heist is happening right before our very eyes. Listen closely and you'll learn how to avoid being one of their marks. The voucher legislation in Idaho is not an isolated incident, but part of a broader strategy by the state's far right to consolidate power. By promoting policies that appeal to wealthy out-of-state donors, these factions aim to secure a steady flow of financial support. This strategy leverages controversial initiatives, such as the voucher scheme, as a magnet for contributions. These funds are instrumental in maintaining the influence of far-right legislators, ensuring their continued dominance in Idaho's political landscape. This tactical maneuvering mirrors the mechanics of Charles Ponzi's scheme by creating a facade of legitimacy and prosperity to attract investment. In Ponzi's case, the lure was the promise of high returns on investment through a seemingly innovative financial operation. For Idaho's far right, the investment comes in the form of political contributions, drawn by the promise of advancing a conservative agenda that includes the dismantling of public education in favor of private interests. The voucher scheme therefore becomes a pivotal piece in a larger chess game of political power and influence. By appealing to wealthy donors with the promise of tax benefits and ideologically aligned educational system, Idaho's far right not only secures the financial backing necessary to sustain their loyal legislators, but also advances a broader agenda that reshapes the state's educational and political landscape to their advantage. This strategic exploitation of legislative initiatives for political gain underscores a calculated effort to manipulate the system in a manner that, while legally distinct, echoes the deceptive and self-serving nature of a Ponzi scheme. Former Boise School Superintendent Don Coberly and former Madison County School District Superintendent Geoff Thomas joined me to explain a scheme to shift public tax dollars to fund private school education. Tell me a little bit about yourself, Geoff.
Well, I grew up largely on a dairy farm in northwest Wisconsin and attended public schools. My mom and family and I moved out to Utah, and so I attended Utah State and Idaho State, and I was a classroom teacher for 7 years in Utah, and then I joined the dark side of school administration. And when we moved to Idaho in 1991 and worked my way up the ladder, and my last 20 years of my career, I was the superintendent of Madison School District in Rexburg, Idaho. And I'm married to my wife of 40 years, Jenna Lee. We have 5 children and 7 amazing, brilliant, talented, and incredible grandchildren.
Wow. Congratulations. What about you, Don?
So I come from a military family. My dad was a full colonel in the Army. And so we moved around all over the world, lived in Turkey and Germany and several installations in Virginia. Went to ninth grade in Virginia, and then he decided to move us out here. He was going to retire, and Boise's actually a retirement destination for a lot of military because of Gowan Field and the Officers Club there, and then Mountain Home and the commissary and PX down there. So I went to Bora High School here in Boise, graduated there, and then went to the University of Idaho. Then got my master's at Boise State and my doctorate at U of I. I taught for 7 years as well, first 3 in CUNA and then in Boise. And then, kind of the same thing, worked my way up the ranks. I was a language arts supervisor, curriculum director, deputy superintendent, and then superintendent for 9 years from 2010 to 2019, and then retired right before COVID hit.
Perfect timing, I guess. Which district were you the superintendent of?
Boise.
Boise School. Oh, okay.
Yeah, Boise School District, yeah.
Is that the largest in the state, or is there?
It was. Boise was the largest for a portion of my tenure, and then West Ada surpassed it. And West Ada's 15,000 larger now
Oh, wow.
than Boise. It's by far the largest district in the state.
How many kids would you say were in your district under your care?
When I started, there were about 27,000, 26,500, somewhere in there. When I finished, it was about 25,500. It really kind of varied depending on the size of the kindergarten class coming in and the size of the seniors leaving, you know.
Right.
But yeah, still a large school district.
So I've noticed there's been a trend of a lot of growth in Idaho, a lot of people moving in from other states. And we saw some figures showing that a lot of them coming from Washington, Oregon, California. And the vast majority of them were coming, I think it was like 60, 70% were Republicans or leaning Republican and came here for conservative values. What did you see as far as some of the parents coming in? What were some of the trends you saw of parents? Was there a shift in their behavior, what they were asking for, what their needs were?
Yeah, I think there have been some changes. And I don't know that they've affected the Boise district as much as they have the valley going out toward Middleton, Caldwell, et cetera, and especially the West Ada district, where you've seen, if you saw, there was a story a few weeks ago about the race for Eagle Mayor being between the folks who'd been there for a while but were from California and the brand new ones that had moved here with their pensions. And that was kind of an interesting story because I think it really reflected the changes in demographics in the valley. But I would say in Boise, I mean, we just had a mayoral election recently, and I think it was about 65-35 for the incumbent mayor. And Boise's pretty blue comparatively.
What about you, Geoff? What have you seen?
I think for us in eastern Idaho, we had a we had parents and families moving in from all over Texas, Colorado, just everywhere, California, you name a state, we had parents moving in, and part of it was because we had Brigham Young University, Idaho, in our backyard, and so people came for those reasons to work there, or because their kids are going there, they decided to move the whole family. But one of the interesting things I found is they were stunned by the quality of the public
Mm-hmm.
education system
Oh, wow. Got
because they had come from places, in some cases, they're like, whoa, our public school system, wherever they came from, didn't have this, didn't do this. But you guys here in Eastern Idaho, wow, you have this and you have that and you have the other thing. And a good vocational program, a great academic program, teachers who cared about kids and, all those kinds of things. And so we were, fortunate because I think in Don's district, and Don was a light. I always saw Boise as a lighthouse district, and I tried to emulate what he was doing over there in my own district as much as we could. We were about 5,400 students, so we weren't near the size, but I always felt like let's be ahead of the curve. Let's give parents what they want. Let's try to accommodate because that's what we do. We're in public service, so let's be of service to their children and to them. And we were really fortunate that way. So we were judged, you know, very favorably by people coming in from out of state, going, "Wow, you guys do this, and you reach out, and you have these programs." And yeah, we do.
Mm-hmm.
So people actually liked the public school system here in Idaho. Even
They
people coming in here, people who lived here. What were what were some of the biggest, I mean, it's not all perfect, right? I'm sure there's challenges. What would you say some of the biggest challenges you heard from parents around the state that the districts faced?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges that we had, even though I think we were trying to meet it as best as we possibly could, were parents that moved in that had, there was a tremendous growth in the number of autistic children or kids on the autism spectrum, and then trying to hire enough trained, certified special ed teachers that could accommodate these children and this growth. That was a real challenge for us, and it still is. It's ongoing. Um, we didn't anticipate that autistic spectrum trend to hit us as quickly as it did, but it grew and it was growing, and now we have special ed populations, anywhere between 10 and 12% of the overall population, and they require the teachers to have a different certification than a regular ed teacher, and those teachers are at a premium. because it's
Hmm.
time intensive, it's paper intensive, and you really need to understand the handicapping condition of the child. And so that was a challenge for us, for sure.
That's actually really interesting you bring that up because, a question pops in my head is you're hearing this debate right now about public education versus private schools and how parents who are sending their kids to private schools are saying, you hear this concept of school choice, but, I believe school choice exists, isn't it? Homeschooling versus charter school versus private schools versus public education, a lot of options. It's just that you're responsible for paying for your own private education. But to your point about special education needs, autistic kids, things like this, what requirements do private schools have right now, especially now that they're asking for public money via vouchers, tax credits, whatever you want to call it? How does that work?
Well, they're not required to take those students. So oftentimes, when you really think about it, if a school doesn't have to take those students and could also sort among those who might be from high poverty backgrounds, then they're not really serving the same population as a public school district would. And I think that's one of the key differences. Boise is about 13% special ed and about 45% free and reduced lunch, which means kids that qualify for those services from the federal school lunch program. And, the state average is about 40, 48, 47, 48, right in there. So that's a different picture than you're going to see if you go to one of the private schools in the state. Um, I think that's one of the big differences, Geoff. You think so too?
I do. And, one of the great things about public education, it's really an American success story.
Mhm.
Because just like our nation, public school, we take everyone, from ages, 5 to 18 or 21, depending on the severe special needs students. We welcome all, whether, regardless of their ability to learn, it doesn't matter about their race, their English language abilities, their socioeconomic status, their gender, their sexual orientation. It doesn't matter. We welcome all children. And that can't be said of some of these private and parochial schools, which they're quite restrictive. And I think, it lends to this point where public dollars should support public endeavors that, it's open to all. And it's,
Hmm.
kind of like, going to Yellowstone, it belongs to all of us, and public schools belong to all of us. And frankly, I think we're one of the greatest American success stories. I can't tell you the tens of millions of people who have gone through the public education system, incredibly successful. And the miracles that take place every day in our schools, where we take children where they're at and help them become, their best selves academically. And I was thinking when Don was talking, one of the neat things, you talk about opportunities. In Madison, we had 27 sports clubs and activities, everything from um, wrestling to rodeo to welding to, you know, beginning math to advanced calculus. I can't even spell calculus. But anyway, we have this huge variety of opportunities for kids. And that's what public schools are all about. And, that's why I'm a diehard, complete 100% fan of public education.
I think what Jeffrey says is really true, and I think about the things that really allowed Boise during my tenure to really compete on a pretty high level, because that's always the byword is, well, you got to compete with the private schools and everything. Well, we have excellent music programs, good art programs, really fine opportunities in foreign language, and in Boise we really focused on advanced placement as well. And so our high schools in the district were very, very competitive, and it was difficult for the private schools to get a real foothold because those offerings were there for kids, along with the best teachers, in my opinion, in the state. And those private schools have great teachers, but they don't hold a candle to uh, the public school teachers in the Boise system or in Madison.
So going back to this idea of vouchers, there's a bill right now, and I can't remember the number, that's being presented. I want to say it's Wendy Horman and Laura Den Hartog are bringing it.
Right.
And this happened, a year ago. They tried it. It was Lenny and Nichols or someone else was trying it. I can't remember who. We're pushing this thing, and they came up with different names for it. It was what was there's a tax credit now, but they called it something else before. But
Educational savings account.
educational savings account, ESA.
Yeah,
Like that.
yeah,
And
education.
then they, if we're just instead of playing word games or word salad, I mean, as far as I know, these are just different flavors of vouchers, right? It's public money being given to parents to pay for private school education. What would you say the pros and cons of this are? Like, how would you describe it? Because as a parent, I've got kids. We do mixed things. Some of our kids are homeschooled. Some of them go to public school. We've tried private school before and different options. So I'm familiar with these as a parent. So I felt like I always had school choice, but I understand like, hey, if I've got a private school or a kid in private school, tuition's expensive. If I can get a break for that, that sounds nice. But what's the impact for everybody?
Well, I think just to start off, and Don's a real expert in understanding so many of these issues, but just starting off, the vast majority of private schools are Boise based
Mhm.
or in larger urban centers in Idaho. So what about the people who live in Leadore or Chalice or Salmon or Arco? They won't be able to take advantage of this. That's number one. So it excludes 90% of most Idahoan parents. That's number one. Then number two is, I'm completely in favor of private schools and parochial schools. I think those are fine. I shouldn't have to pay for it. It shouldn't come out of my tax dollars. If a person chooses to send their child to a private school of whatever, or why would I do that? Why do I have to pay for it? And particularly parochial schools. And I grew up in my area in Wisconsin. We had Lutheran schools, we had Catholic schools, and then we had public schools. And those schools were fine, and kids got a good education there. But no Lutheran parent was expected to pay their tax dollars to support someone else's Catholic education, and vice versa. So, and I believe in a parental right to teach their child their particular religion or indoctrinate them in their religion. But I shouldn't have to pay that. And this nation was founded the First Amendment. There shall not be an establishment of religion, and this is a slippery slope to doing that. Why are tax dollars being paid to religious groups and religious schools? I'm completely opposed, as you can tell by my the way I'm talking about it.
Well, let me tag on to that just a bit. So, this is the fifth straight year we've seen some sort of voucher, ESA, tax credit proposal. And typically what happens is there's an amount allocated for the first year. That was not the case last year with the bill that basically opened the whole thing up within the first 2 years. But the problem is that it's always posed with the idea, well, we're just going to start small. Well, if you look at what's happened in the state of Arizona, we're now looking at an out of control education budget. Basically, they're funding two education systems, and most of the kids that are part of the voucher program were already enrolled. 70% were already enrolled in private schools before this whole thing came about. And so they were there before and they're there now, but they're taking advantage of the voucher provision. I would say though, I want to echo something that Geoff just said, and that is that the big losers here will end up being rural schools and rural communities. And so if you can think about it this way, if you go out on Friday night to a football game in a small town, everyone's there. The school system is the heart of that community.
Right.
I had the opportunity to drive over to Homedale to watch them play Sugar Salem 2 years ago in the playoffs. You can imagine, Geoff, how there were 5,000 people there. It was crazy. And the problem is the budgets are finite. And so you can't take money, run a separate school system, and not expect that it's not going to hurt anybody. And so if you look at a big school system like West Ada, some of those losses would be at the margins, right? But in a school district like Homedale, if you lose just a portion of your funding, or Sugar Salem, or Ryrie, or Filer, then it's going to damage the offerings the school can make, and over time, it will hurt them very severely. And so, I would think that any rural legislators, or community members would be opposed to the concept of vouchers if they understand what's happened elsewhere went to rural schools under that kind of a plan. And I'm a little bit passionate about that, having seen um, how the rural schools are so important to um, education in Idaho.
Absolutely. And the thing is this is if we just cut to the chase, vouchers are a subsidy for the wealthy. It's a tax break for the wealthy. They get money and they don't need it. They're already, like Don mentioned, they're already sending their children to private schools or parochial schools. They have the means to do that, which is fine. But it's not enough to even begin to cover the cost. But it's enough to, they said, well, they're going to cap it at 50 million for the first year. The first year. Well, where does that money come from? Well, it comes out of the general fund for everyone else. We have a $900 million facility backlog in the state of Idaho. Perhaps we should redirect our resources to address crumbling buildings first, before we go off and try to create a separate, duplicative education system. And in the Constitution of Idaho, the state constitution, it is very clear that it's the responsibility of the state legislature to appropriate money for a free, fair, and open public education system. It does not mention parochial schools. It does not mention private. It's very strong language because when Idaho was created, the founders were very concerned about undue religious influence and tax dollars going for that. And again, it really bothers me when we're subsidizing and people are putting money in, expecting their tax dollars to support a public system that's open to all children, and then it gets siphoned off to subsidize. It's just welfare for the rich. And it's like if you give everybody in the state a chance to have a $5,000 yacht subsidy. Well, a wealthy person can afford it, and they just say, "Oh, thanks for the extra 5,000." But most of us can't afford a yacht, And even with a tax subsidy, we can't put our kids in a private or parochial school because where we live, there's no opportunities. So it really is a twisted, heavily urban, concentric, focused legislation, which I think is just absolutely wrong. And as Don mentioned, it hurts so many of our rural communities, which make up the bulk of Idaho.
So let me ask you, because I'm looking at this bill and looking at the way this works. What's to stop? I mean, you mentioned this idea of a new class of welfare, and I get this picture in my mind. You hear the term like was it Reagan, the Reagan years? It was like everyone's harping on welfare recipients, calling them welfare queens or whatnot. And this new idea pops in my head. It's like, okay, so you have a new class of welfare queens picking up their kids in a brand new BMW. They're paid for by this $5,000 subsidy. It may not be a yacht. I mean, 5,000 is not going to go very far on a yacht, but it will go pretty far on a car payment. So what's to stop someone who's already paying for private school to just spend this money on a new car?
Well, I mean, in the end, if it were applied to tuition, then other things could be purchased with those funds. But it's kind of funny that you would bring that up, because a lot of times what happens is the private school raise tuition following the institution of a voucher program.
That's it, right? Like, well, you can afford this now, so. But then that excludes people who wouldn't be able to do it otherwise.
I think you bring up a really good point, the accountability piece.
Mm-hmm.
And there is, they always say, oh, every expenditure will be accounted for. Well, that's a load of horse bucky. There's not enough auditors in the state of Idaho to oversee every parent that's going to get their $5,000 allotment and how they're going to spend it. And then you have a whole cadre of people who homeschool their children. And they typically homeschool I can't speak for all homeschoolers, but many homeschool because they don't want their children involved with state government or a public or institution. So will homeschoolers have to register their children on a state government registry, then account for that $5,000 in a government with government oversight on their expenditures, how many of those people are really want to get on the rolls? And so, and they typically homeschool because they try to avoid government as they see it. But there's not enough auditors to oversee all these expenditures. And then what constitutes an educational expenditure becomes open to debate. And there's so many flaws in the accountability section of this bill. It has me deeply concerned.
So I'm glad you brought up the homeschool thing. I'm interested in that. So does this really exclude homeschool parents? I mean, you're saying they'd have to register as a school, like basically let's say, oh, I'm forming an LLC, I'm calling it this private school, so I can collect tuition from my own child. Right? Is that what they'd have to do, or can they just continue the freedom of just homeschooling as they do now, which is part of parental rights and school choice that exists in Idaho as it is? So do they really miss out on this private school money? Or to your point, is it that they have to now jump through all these hoops to register with the government to be approved to receive these funds where there might be more accountability or not?
Yeah, in many cases, they don't want to be part of a voucher scheme. And the reason is just what you said. They really they want to homeschool and they want to be left alone. And so when the state gets involved with providing funds, there's going to be strings that come with that. That's just the way they view it. And I think they're probably right. And so it's really ironic to me then that you'll see private schools that in every bill you see come through, there's no accountability. There's no assessment accountability. There's no fiscal accountability, and that's the way they want it. Um, so it's kind of a funny mix when you look at it to where um, I guess my take would be I don't think Jeffrey and I are huge fans of the federal assessments that are out there, and we weren't when we were superintendents either. But we did what we were asked because it was what we were told because it's part of the federal accountability requirements. And to think that you could get away or get out of those is kind of crazy to me. So I can really see where the homeschoolers are coming from with not wanting to be involved in a system like that.
Well, it's interesting because you see the individuals, the groups that are pushing voucher programs over the past few years, especially this last session, you saw groups like the Idaho Freedom Foundation heavily invested in promoting this scheme. And it seemed they're like, if I remember right, one of their stated goals was to destroy or tear down public education, right? They call them government schools. And they want to, tear that down so people have an opportunity to spend more time and money is invested in a religious education. You're seeing a lot more of that with the rise of Christian nationalism, et cetera. What's interesting is, so they're calling themselves these pro-freedom, pro-liberty groups who have traditionally backed homeschooling and really pushed for that. And once again, Idaho is a big homeschooler state. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
parental freedoms there, and that's okay. This seems like it doesn't work. You have the groups that are pro-liberty saying, "Oh no, we want vouchers," but the vouchers don't help our actual constituents, or the people that we have been pushing our pro-liberty, pro-freedom ideas to. Instead, we want to help these wealthy schools, the wealthy parents, and these private schools benefit, but not
Mm-hmm.
really help the people that they're really talking to. So, can you help me understand this? Because it doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I've been going to, in my 30 plus years in Idaho, I can't tell you how many board meetings I've been to and public parent meetings and going to various, speak at various, Rotary, you know, Chamber of Commerce, Kiwanis, meetings, Elks, all Lions, all these groups. And in all that time, in over 30 years, I never had a single native Idahoan come up to me and ask for a school voucher or whatever. How come we don't have vouchers or tax credits? Not one, ever. Not a parent, ever. And so I started thinking about it and I started looking into the out of state fiscal carpetbaggers that are coming in pushing this legislation. And of all the issues that we have in Idaho, and we have a ton of things that we could put this money towards, set aside public education and university education, all those kinds of things. We have infrastructure needs. We have a host of other things. Of all those things, you know, and parents have come to me over the years, over the decades, asking for this, that, or the other thing, wanting to create this, or maybe we can work on that. Not one has brought up a voucher or tax credit ever. And so I think I think our legislators often get pushed by out of state dark money. I call them carpetbaggers. They come in and they wreak havoc and then they leave and we're left holding the bag.
I've heard another word for that. I heard them called grifters.
Grifters. Yeah, that's a good one.
I love that you bring up the word dark money, right? There's a lot of narratives and talk like, oh, don't talk about dark money. We don't want to offend the donors who don't want their identities revealed, even though they're having an outside influence in public policy. So we can't talk about them, even though they're doing more to create change, good or bad, than say someone who's out front who's just having a conversation and posting things on Twitter. I mean, why do they get more protections than anyone else? But yeah, the dark money that's fueling these things. We've heard some of these groups, and like you said, there are a lot of them are from out of state. And it feels like these groups that are in state are latching on to these, even that they don't align with their actual base. If their base is pro homeschooling, pro this and that, and everything else, but then they're pushing a voucher scheme, which is not helping their base, why would they do that unless there's a financial incentive for them? And it feels like it more pushing things that are for their self-interest than actually benefiting the parents of children in this state.
Yeah, I think that's why a couple of the bills we've seen in the last 5 years have specifically excluded homeschoolers. That makes it a little more true to their approach. And there's a part of me that says, let's just cut to the chase. Let's do an advisory ballot on vouchers and explain the potential impacts and let Idahoans express their opinions. Because I think, what will happen. Well, we kind of know, Geoff, because we did a survey that when you pointed out that vouchers would have this impact on rural schools, it was 60-40, if I remember correctly, against vouchers. And I'm certainly willing to go down that road because I have confidence in the way rural Idahoans especially feel about their schools. And I know that folks in Boise and West Ada support their schools as well. So let's just cut to the chase, like I said. Let's quit beating around the bush and saying, hey, we're going to pass this, even though we don't know where Idahoans stand. Because, frankly, I think I do. And I guess we could have Reclaim Idaho versus the Mountain States Policy Institute or whatever. But we need to get the information out there and let Idahoans tell us how they feel. There.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that other organization. I know a little bit about Mountain States Policy Center. I'm not that familiar with them. I met some of their board members, and when they first launched, I was like, feels like IFF light, right? Are they the good cop to IFF bad cop? What's going on here? Then I went to their policy dinner a few months back, I think in the winter, and they're saying, oh, we're not going to get involved in policy or in legislation. We're just going to talk about policy, put out our we're not going to put out a scorecard or anything like that. But then you're seeing them be heavily invested in this voucher idea, which makes me wonder, what are they really interested in here? Is it pushing these private schools? What's their connection to these private schools? And my understanding is at that event, they were promoting a particular school. And I thought that was interesting. What is the relationship here? And I think people need to understand more about why these groups are promoting the things they're doing. Show a little more transparency. I don't particularly have any animosity towards Mountain States Policy Center. I know there's some good people involved with that group, but I struggle to understand what is their end goal here. Why are they doing that? And then you see them, other groups like that zombie organization, the Freedom Foundation, what's left of it, pushing the same thing. And now it's like different legislators, but when you see which legislators are pushing which bill, like last time it was Linney and Nichols, who are 98, 97, 100%, not score based, but obedient to their scoring system, their indexes. And now you have ones that are more on the fringes pushing it because it feels like, they've always kind of been working with them, but also saying, well, I'm not, look at my score, it's not that great. Well, but then you never see them get attacked, which this group always attacks those that don't agree with them or are seen as a threat. So they're non-threatening, they're embraced, or they're not attacked for these things. And here they are doing the work that you'd see typically a very obedient zombie organization group pushing. So, what's your thoughts on kind of the strategy behind this time? Like, what's different about the approach this year versus last year?
I mean, personally, I don't see it as being a ton different. I mean, it's a different. Every year, it's a different methodology. It's tax
Right.
credits or it's blah blah blah, and most years it's a certain amount to start off with. But we may want to expand this if it works. Quote works. What I don't know exactly what that means, but from my perspective, it's the same end goal as it was 5 years ago.
Mhm.
And I guess one of the things that really, I don't know, I don't think it surprises me knowing the nature of Idahoans having lived here for so long. They're very independent and they don't want, folks jamming something like that down their throats. So, I mean, I'm actually not that surprised at that. But
I
what do you
think
think,
it,
Jeff?
I think that legislation, good, effective legislation, is thoughtful, organic, and comes from the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
When people, stand up and there's a groundswell of Idahoans that say, we want A, B, or C. That's when legislation is effective because that's when legislators are reflecting the will of the people
Mm-hmm.
they represent. What happens here is you have this artificial construct that honestly, and I go back to what I said before, I've been in the education business like Don for decades in Idaho. In administration, I work with people and parents. We passed 8 bond and levy elections when I was in Rexburg. It's a very conservative area, but it's what people wanted and what we needed. And I never have heard of anyone ever asking for a voucher, ever, from
Hmm.
the most liberal person to the most conservative parents that I worked with. So I'm not sure. To your questions, you listed out a whole host of really valid, important questions that need to be answered. But I think when you get these out of state grifters, carpetbaggers coming in, pushing their agenda, because they can take legislators out and wine and dine them and lobby them. Well, most of us don't have the time or the money to go and wine and dine and take our legislators out to, San Francisco or LA or Seattle and show them a really good time. We have to go to work. And so I think that legislation, it was shot down, I don't know, at least 5 times last year. Why bring it back again this year? And no one I know is asking for it,
Mm-hmm.
except for the people who keep in the legislature to keep, putting a bill out there. They keep putting a bill out there. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and I think I have at least a partial answer to the whole thing of why they're pushing this at the legislature, and I think part of it has to do with the fact BSU Public Policy Survey last week pointed out that a lot of people just don't have any idea. And I mean, with us being involved in education, we kind of know, well, this is what we don't like about vouchers, et cetera. But what they don't know is that there are 20 Idaho counties that don't even have a private school.
Yeah.
So a voucher bill certainly, even if they wanted to, doesn't benefit them. And there are 5 counties in the state that have 75% of the private schools. Well, guess what? If you fund a voucher bill, where's most of the money going? Those 5 counties.
Yep.
So
Exactly.
you'll see Ada and Twin Falls and Bannock all have private facilities that could be funded through vouchers, and a bunch of others don't have anything.
Wait, so this just popped in my head. You're talking about the largest population centers in Idaho, Ada County, Boise, etc., which traditionally, if we look at Boise and other places, those are more blue. So, in theory, if this thing passes, Democrats are going to benefit from this more than Republicans.
I hadn't really thought of it that way. In terms of Boise, Boise is a pretty blue
So,
community, and Pocatello would be one of the few others that is too. Um,
right. So, why is, we'll just call them the far right or whoever they are, pushing for something that's going to help their enemy, the leftists.
I mean, I think it's the concept of
Yeah,
private schools. They haven't probably
sure.
thought through where they're all located and everything, but it stands to reason that the predominant number of private schools would be in larger communities. It's hard to do a private school in Weiser. There's just not the population to do it. And so there's not that opportunity either because they have a good public school system and people, that's where they send their kids. They want to be Wolverines or they want to be Homedale Trojans or, I mean, that's just kind of the way that works. And unfortunately, the predominant amount of money would be headed to the urban areas of the state. That's just the way it is.
Okay, so vouchers benefit urban areas where there are more Democrats. They do if you jump through a lot of hoops, right? To register your school, register with the government, get on the government list, government approved to receive the funds. A homeschooler could do this, maybe, but that's a lot of hoops. It sounds like. I don't know. Do they have to register as a nonprofit business, set up an LLC, and spend $1,000 just to register the business plus the annual fees and everything else associated with that? It sounds like there's cost to register yourself as an actual school. Geoff, you brought up something else, which is bonds. How in the past, Madison County and other counties, I remember seeing this issue in Bonneville County, where I lived for many years. This idea of bonds initially getting passed, right? There wasn't an issue. And then suddenly there's a huge resistance to bonds and levies passing. And you're seeing the same idea with budgets, right? Well, we want to get rid of maintenance costs. We want to make everything line items so we can look at this IFF spending index and say, no, because
Right.
spending money is not conservative. So therefore, we want to hold the purse strings so that people have to come beg to us for money, which is, another power structure. So what happened? What happened in your experience between when bonds used to pass and school facilities were being taken care of to where you have counties who are like, hey, we might have to cancel football if we don't pass this levy or this bond?
Yeah, I think a couple things. Just structurally, it's very difficult to pass a bond in Idaho. Idaho and Kentucky are the only two states in the nation that require a supermajority or 66 and two-thirds of those who vote in order to pass a bond. So it's a very high threshold to begin with. I think what's happened in recent years that caused fewer bonds to pass is the rising property values and then rising assessments. And so people are feeling that more than they had, for example, a number of years ago, where now it's, their property assessment has gone up every year for the last 4 years. And then here comes the school district to ask for more, to add even more onto their assessed value. So I think that has been a real challenge. And of course, that happens when you have growth and
Mhm.
people. Idaho's been discovered, and people move here, and they inflate the home prices, and that's it's a real challenge. The problem is that we face, and so in my 20 years in Madison County, I conducted 11 elections. So it's one almost every other year, and it's exhausting. And I'm a trained educator and administrator, not a trained politician and campaigner, but I had to become one like Don did, passing bonds in Boise. And if you ask any superintendent in the state what's the worst four-letter word they can think of, it will be bond. They don't
Yeah.
want to do it. They only ask when they're desperate, and but yet it all the responsibility falls on their shoulders to try to get this thing passed in a community. And some communities are really strapped.
Mhm.
They're hard pressed economically, and it's very difficult to go ask people to voluntarily tax themselves. And so the project that's being asked for has to be apparent, and it has to be worthwhile in the eyes of the patrons. And and so often a superintendent's so busy running a district, which is really a small city. You've got everything from transportation and food service and security and curriculum and testing and assessments and all that stuff going on, and athletics and artistic stuff and athletic stuff. You got ball games, you got all this stuff going on. And then in addition to that, oh, by the way, we need a new elementary school because we're growing. Well, a
Mhm.
new elementary school is $20 million. And you're like, ah, son of a. And
Right.
then you got to convince your board, and then you got to convince the administrators, and then the teacher association going, what the heck. And the list goes on and on. And your life, one of the reasons I retired when I did, I had a 3-year contract, I had a great supportive board, and just like, it was just like, and my board chair came to me and said, Geoff, we really need to go bond for a new elementary. And he was absolutely right. But I was on empty. My campaign tank was at empty. I wasn't even on fumes. And I just thought, someone else needs to carry the football for this, across the goal line on this last one. It's exhausting to have to campaign, but that's what we require superintendents to do, and we're not equipped to do it. Then, in addition to that, and I know I'm belaboring this, but then there's no money to help you get the word out. And the legislature has restricted any kind of public money being used, even for information. I mean, it's almost you violate the law by even telling people. I had superintendents say, "Well, I can't even talk about the bond and tell people to vote yes, or I get in trouble with the law." And I'm going, no, wait a second. After 4 p.m., it's your time. You can go out on your own dime and time and go, blah, 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 blah. But then you have these private organized, resistors and organized opposition. They can raise as much money as they want to and run ads and run radio spots. So you're really up against a number of challenges when you're trying to pass a bond. The miracle is when a bond does pass, because that shows, that you've superseded all of these logistical hurdles, and some are very, very high.
You bring up an interesting point about not being able to talk about bonds. In Bonneville County recently, there was a prosecutor who was backed by, I want to say, some people who run the local party, so local party bosses who may also have some ties to the zombie organization, who tried to, I want to say he almost tried to prosecute or went after and filed it was
They
weird. It was
did.
like a civil lawsuit from the local county or prosecuting attorney, whatever you call them there in Bonneville County, going after school board or school was the
The
superintendent or
school
trustees.
superintendent.
Yeah, for even the mere mention of a bond campaign. And I think they settled it or whatever it was. It was like
Mm.
minor
$200 or
slap on the
something,
wrist. Yeah,
$300.
$200, whatever, was a squall. And I think the time spent on it was way more cost than the $200 fine if you count the hours invested in it. But it was all about optics. It was all about punishing school districts for trying to you know repair. I mean, what is it in Bonneville County, Idaho Falls High School, right? They have the one high school. They've been trying to build another one. The
Mhm.
population has grown substantially, and they're struggling for year after year after year trying to pass a bond, and they can't get a new school built. And there's so much resistance to this. And I remember the campaigns pushed by these same individuals, these groups, saying, "Oh no, we like Legacy High School. We like this old high school because that's the trend right now." You're like, what? Who wants to go to an old high school where there's where the building's falling apart? It was 50 to 100-year-old building, and there's no room to grow because there's literally nowhere to push out to. You have a field that floods every year. You have to walk,
Mhm.
and it's just it's a mess, and it's overcrowded. And what is the solution? Just add more trailers? What do they call those pods,
Portable.
portables? That's not where you want to send your kids. I imagine as a parent, I'm like, I want my kid to have a good education. You see some of these nicer high schools, they're newer, they have better facilities. And that becomes a struggle. And it goes back to the thing we talked about before, these groups that want to destroy and tear down public education. And this is a very effective way to do that, is to run campaigns to kill bonds. One other thing I want to talk about. So I want to say there was a levy issue or bond that was trying to be passed up in West Bonner School District, and it failed. And so they were running into shortfalls. They were not getting enough money. And then you get this guy to come in as a superintendent. You know the story.
Mhm.
Tell me a little bit about what happened up there.
Yeah, well, they had a long history of having short-term superintendents, and being a superintendent's very, very difficult.
Mhm.
It's one of the hardest jobs in public education because you have to be the chief cook and bottle washer for and know school law, school finance, school curriculum. You have to be on top of assessments. You have to be on top of state and federal laws, plus local board policies. You work, you're hired, but your board are elected. And so they have, depending on who's on the board, they have different viewpoints and goals and objectives and political viewpoints as well. And so, really, to be a superintendent, you need to have you're licensed. You need to have experience as a teacher, as a principal, and work your way up the ranks. So you have this wealth of experience. So when you become superintendent, when you land on your feet in that job, you kind of have an understanding of what the job requires. And what happened up there, they had people that had experience. That they had a lady that could have stepped into the role, but the board decided to go with someone without any teaching experience, without any administrative experience, without any superintendent experience, and they stuck him in this situation. And immediately there were challenges and problems, and deadlines being missed on this grant and on this policy, and so on and so forth. It would be like, you have a toothache, you go to a dentist and they go, well, we know we had trouble getting in a dentist, so we hired Bob here, and he's got a chisel, but he's a nice guy, and he's been to dentists before, so he's going to work on your abscess tooth there. Hope you don't mind. It's ludicrous in any profession, but somehow that board at that time decided to hire someone with zero experience, like it was going to become the magical dentist of the year, and it didn't work out.
Yeah, I mean, it's from my perspective, the gentleman is very, very bright. And it was a classic case of book learning versus having been in a position where you can learn the ins and outs and daily dealings of a school district. Yeah, I mean, as Jeffrey said, there are just certain things that when you're on the job for a while in a school district and you've been in administration, you can say, well, they're a product of the system, but they also know how to deal with federal programs, how to deal with special ed, how to deal with all the issues that come up, whether you're in a large or a small district. And that West Bonner district, I had a chance to visit with several of the people up there. They are great people, and they care deeply about their kids. And I mean, obviously there was a recall election, and then the board election went, I think it's 3-2 now, the folks who were kind of the traditionalists in the district. And that's fine. They had their election. It's going to work out. They still have some folks who might be opposed to particular things they want to do, but they now have a superintendent who is experienced in the ins and outs and daily operation of a school district, and they're back on track to a great degree. I know there is legislation being proposed in the House that would deal with the situation where, if you remember, they only had 3 board members, and one of the board members stopped showing up, so they wouldn't have quorum. And I think that's hopefully going to get taken care of because it was manipulation of the system that was really, really kind of unnecessary. And I hope that West Bonner can get back on its feet. I did some analysis of West Bonner's academic performance. I mean, from what I could tell, it's right in the middle of school districts in the state. They probably have some areas they really need to improve. So does Boise. So does Madison. But you need someone who understands how the system works in order to efficiently operate a district on a day-to-day basis. That's the bottom line.
So this brings up another thing, the idea of local control, right? So a school district, the people in the school districts, the parents vote for the trustees that hire the superintendent, make the local decisions. One issue that's come up recently is this idea of arming teachers.
I knew you were going to say that.
There's 2 sides to this, right? And I remember there was a podcast recently where one legislator who voted against this, she's a conservative legislator. She was actually elected by the conservative groups, and they've now turned on her because she's like, these guys are kind of difficult to work with. But she's saying, vote against it. Not that she's opposed to securing schools and protecting the kids with firearms and turning off this idea of concept of gun-free zones, but that we shouldn't have the state dictate something that the local parents and local districts should control. What are your thoughts on that? The idea of local versus state control on these issues?
Well, I was sitting in the legislature as a sub when this all went down. So if you'd like me to
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, basically, school districts can already allow teachers to be armed. They can conceal carry. They must get the permission of the principal and the school board, and the district has to have a policy in place. So
Right.
Mountain View School District in Grangeville, which covers not only Grangeville, but Koosky and Elk City, and it's a
Right.
huge landmass of a district, has done that. They have an excellent policy in place, and it's working for them. So to have the legislation then say that a teacher can, or a school employee, any school employee, could conceal carry and just inform the principal and the superintendent, and not the school board, by the way, to me that seemed kind of ludicrous, because we already have a policy that allows for it and keeps the lines of communication in place. And so I just personally thought it was a really bad idea, because there were so many holes in the legislation, and we already have a procedure by which schools can allow for that. And guess what? Locally, it works pretty well. I think there are 10 or 15 school districts that have those kind of policies in place already.
And I think too that, educational decisions, the further away from the child the decision is made, the worse the decision.
Yeah.
So, when you have parents and teachers and people in local communities, your kids, your teachers, your principals, that's where local control really, really works. Because, versus somebody in Boise trying to make a decision for somebody in Rexburg or whatever, it works on a statewide basis. But when you really are making decisions that really and truly impact at the local level, it should be local decisions made there first.
Mm-hmm.
To Don's point. And the other thing is I'm a gun owner. I like to go to the range. Um, and, I'm not an expert, but the idea that somehow you put a gun in the hand of somebody is all of a sudden, you've got a more secure situation just doesn't bear fruit. And and even on the range, 10, 15 yards away from the target with no wind and no stress, sometimes you still get a pattern. Just, if you move your hand, just in whatever, unless you're really, really good, and I'm not that good, to give a teacher a gun in the most stressful situation that anyone would ever face in their entire life. Let's say an armed intruder came into school.
Mhm.
And to assume that that teacher will know that weapon so well and have such a clear and level head and be able to take out the armed intruder without harming themselves or other students, innocent, bystanders, all those things, I think it's a stretch. Even law enforcement in those situations, and they're trained. It's a difficult situation for them to be in, and making sure that they can really find out who the really bad, where the bad person is, and differentiate in a highly stressful, terrible situation. And just assume that anybody is just out of the blue. Oh, by the way, armed intruder. Well, I'm really glad I've got my Glock on me today. What if you shoot an innocent child?
Right.
What if a teacher shoots, even if you shoot and kill the bad, let's say it's a kid, and you kill that kid, you live with that forever.
Tragic, yeah.
And so that's why law enforcement is so good at law enforcement, and teachers are so good at being teachers. And there are those situations where the schools are so remote. I understand why they do what they do.
Exactly.
But it needs to be a decision that is really thoughtful.
Mm-hmm.
Am I the kind of person that will act with clarity and calm and be able to put stress aside? And heaven forbid you ever have to do that. But I think a person really needs to take a hard look in the mirror before they make that decision to arm themselves.
And Geoff, there's a reason that nobody asked for this.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I mean, the IEA didn't want it. The ISBA, the Student School Boards Association, the Idaho Association of School Administrators, the state SRO organization, school resource officers, the sheriffs. Nobody wanted this.
Yeah.
Except for one organization.
Just one real quick example. There was a some unfortunate soul that in Rexburg decided to rob a bank. And he went around the side of the building. This was a number of years ago. The side of the building, and law enforcement came really quick where that guy was. The guy took out a gun, fired at the officers. The officers fired back. It was against the side of in the alleyway of the bank building. And the guy was, 6 feet, 200 pounds, something like that. And there are at least 25 bullet holes all over the side of, and they've patched them now and stuff, but you could, for years later, you could go by and see where the bullets hit. Now, these are trained law enforcement.
Right.
But their adrenaline is going,
Right.
They're being shot at, they're ducking and they're shooting, but the pattern, the bullet holes go up 15 feet, up above where a person could, a 6-foot person, and they're all over the building. I have tremendous admiration for law enforcement because I can only imagine how stressful, especially in those situations, that their job is. And your adrenaline's flowing, your life is in danger. My hat's off, and I have huge respect for them. To just automatically translate that to a teacher, I don't know. It's just I don't think it's a wise idea.
Well, a couple of things. One, there was a teacher I want to say it was in Utah, that was armed, and they went to the bathroom. They shot themselves accidentally while they were using the restroom. They just mishandling the firearm. Then you look at trained law enforcement officers in Texas and in Florida, Parkland, right, where I want to say, was it Parkland, where the resource officer stayed back, didn't, trained, armed, everything, didn't stop the shooter. In Texas, you had the shooting where they had a massive police response. They didn't go in and they didn't save the kids. So many things went wrong in these places where trained individuals who know how to use a firearm, to your point, didn't save the kids. That's not what saved the kids. And it's tragic, right? It's tragic that these things happen. I'm a gun owner. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. And I understand, the idea, this thought process of, well, if the teacher's armed, then somebody's there protecting my kid. Now, okay, just in theory, that sounds okay. But when you get into the practical aspects of this, to your point, what's next? Are we going to tell teachers they have to carry and they have to take that responsibility? The same podcast I was listening to with this legislator, she was saying how it's like the emergency exit row, right? You're asking someone, hey, do you accept this responsibility of this plane? If there's something wrong with this plane, that you're going to be the one opening this door and helping people out. You're volunteering to take that responsibility. And in an emergency, that is a very serious responsibility that you're agreeing to. But if you don't want that responsibility, you're like, no, I don't want to do that. And that's okay. You can opt out. But this idea that it's directed from the state, so we're adding more government, this is an expansion of government, dictating what the local school districts can and cannot do or should do. That just doesn't feel like a conservative value, taking away local control. Because to your point, school districts already allow guns in the schools. They already can allow these programs. Okay.
They can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it wasn't really a problem. It feels like solution in search of a problem. And we see a lot of that. Vouchers, solution in search of a problem. This issue and others. Okay. Last thing, I keep seeing this report or hearing about this report about the state of Idaho facilities. What is your thought on this? Like how things are just degraded? Is this factual? Is there truth to this? Or is this something is this a growing problem? Or is it something that's overstated?
I think the report is completely accurate, and it reflects the current condition of our facilities statewide for K-12 buildings. So when I just give you an example. When I went to Madison in 2001, we had two elementary schools that were still coal-fired. We had our newest elementary had been built in 1960. And, these were aging, dilapidated buildings. I had one building that had one elementary school. It was the worst school facility I have ever seen. It had mold. Windows were cracked. The cement was bad. The wiring was bad. They didn't have a cafeteria, really. They ate in a white spot of the hallway. They had rodents. The ceiling was crumbling. I mean, it was depressing. It looked like a private maximum security prison that wasn't doing well.
Wow.
And it was. I mean, it had everything you can think of facility wise. I had architecture firm come and do a rating on it, and they rated it F. So I had a number of facilities that had tremendous problems. And I remember sitting down with the school board after I'd been hired. I said, have you guys been out into the buildings to see the facilities? And they said, well, what are you talking about? So I took a tour. And I took our maintenance guy and showed them. And they're like, holy cow, we've got a problem. And my district was not unique in that.
Mm.
And I think what had happened is because nobody wanted to bond, because it's so difficult, previous superintendents that I, succeeded didn't want to touch it. They didn't want to get, you can't raise enough money through a supplemental levy to really address facilities. Buildings are expensive. But I told my wife, I says, I'm about ready not to take the job. It's going to take 10 years and $60 million to fix the problem.
Wow.
And that's not even our high school. And she says, well, buck up, little, camper, you took the job, you better do it. So we did it. And, but it was 20 years later and over $120 million that we had to raise to address our facilities. Now Madison has really nice facilities, but someone had to take the bull by the horns. And fortunately, the community rallied behind us and it was very supportive. So we were fortunate.
Yeah. And again, one of the things, Greg, is that a lot of what we're seeing is in rural districts, again, that either can't pass a bond or don't even run one because they don't think they can. And so you get situations like Salmon School District where you've got sewage backing up in one of the toilets and under the lunchroom. It's just an awful situation. And you have a few school districts that can get after it and pass a bond. Boise happens to be one of those. We passed a bond that was $173 million. That was the extent of the needs in the schools, and most of them surrounded safety. I mean, we had an elementary school. Whittier Elementary had 10 portables on the grounds. So we had kindergartners walking to the main building to use the restroom. Now, that poses a little bit of a safety issue if you think about it.
Yes.
And now, 5 years later, if you drive around Boise, it's the same thing as in Rexburg. We've got some buildings that have really been upgraded. We have new facilities in some cases. I mean, we had a couple where they just needed to be torn down, and they were rebuilt, and they look great. But again, it's not only the 2/3 vote, that's tough to get, a super majority. And then now we're looking at it, if the facilities measure in the legislature were to pass, it will restrict the dates on which you can run bonds even more. I believe there's a March date now, and you won't be able to use that one anymore. So what happens is it's all kind of moving down toward just the November date, the general election. And you obviously will have more voters out, but more voters who probably don't have the same level of empathy for the issues in the school district. So there you have it.
Well, thank you so much. Is there any last parting thoughts, parting wisdom you want to share with everyone?
Parting wisdom. I'd just like to say, Don and I are 100% opposed to vouchers or tax credits or ESAs or whatever, for all the reasons that we mentioned in this podcast. Idahoans don't want vouchers. Idaho don't want tax credits. This is being pushed by out-of-state grifter carpetbagger types, and that will benefit very, very few. And I refuse to use my tax dollars to subsidize wealthy people to send their kids to exclusive private schools where they can pick and choose what kids they want to come in, or parochial schools. I think public dollars need to be used for public.
Here's a kind of a closing statement. I spent the last 3 weeks down at the legislature subbing for one of our Boise representatives, and I have met a lot of legislators, folks who are very supportive of education. And quite frankly, I think when they're presented with the facts surrounding vouchers and the fact that it will hurt, especially those that are from rural Idaho, and a lot of them are, that it will hurt their communities, I think they'll make the right decision. We just have to make sure we get that information in their hands and that they can consider it as they're making decisions. I'm confident of it. They're good people, and they want to make the right decision, but we have to give them the information that will help them do so.
Disclaimer. The following is intended to convey an opinion on newsworthy events of public concern regarding public figures and or public officials in the exercise of their official duties. No implications or inferences beyond those explicitly stated in the proceeding are intended to be conveyed or endorsed by the author. Wherever available, links have been provided to allow the listeners or readers to directly access any underlying assertions of fact upon which this opinion is based.